This is Macro Voices with hedge fund manager Eric Townsend, the free weekly financial podcast targeting professional finance, high net worth individuals, family offices, and other sophisticated investors. Macro Voices is all about the brightest minds in the world of finance and macroeconomics telling it like it is, bullish or bearish, no holds barred. Now, here are your hosts, Eric Townsend and Patrick Serezna.
Macro Voices episode 126 was recorded on July 12, 2018. I'm Eric Townsend. Dr. Pippa Malmgren, former advisor to 2 U.S. presidents, is one of my personal favorite guests that we've featured on past Macro Voices episodes. She's an expert on geopolitics with a specific emphasis on how geopolitical events influence financial markets. She's brilliant, and she's back as this week's feature interview guest. Obviously, we're going to run through the usual list of geopolitical topics, including China, trade wars, North Korea, Russia, and so forth. But what I think you're really going to be interested in is Pippa's view that social media data mining is the new geopolitical frontier that has captured the attention of governments around the world. Her perspective on what something like the Cambridge Analytica scandal could look like in a future where quantum computing is pervasive is downright frightening. All that and more is coming up in this week's feature interview. Last December, Patrick shared with me his top 10 predictions for 2018. Unfortunately, at the time, we couldn't share them with Macro Voices listeners out of respect for his big picture trading clients who were paying for exclusive access to those predictions. So I made a pact with Patrick to wait 6 months and then review those predictions on the air on Macro Voices. So be sure to stay tuned for our post-game segment after the feature interview, because it's time to hold Patrick to account. We'll review all 10 of his 2018 predictions and discuss both what he got right as well as what he got wrong, along with a mid-year update on what he sees coming for the rest of the year.
And I'm Patrick Serezna. Now, Eric, that S&P 500 is just under 2,800, itching to break out. But at the same time, the NASDAQ has already broken to a fresh new high. Is this the breakout? What's your thinking?
Well, Patrick, I think that probably this is the beginning of the breakout, but it hasn't quite happened yet. You know, as we came into today's closing bell, I'm watching my futures screen, and those S&P E-minis are there at 27.99, spot 75, 2,800, 99.75, 2,800, 99.75. There's a tug of war between the bulls and the bears just on that one tick coming up on the round number of 2,800 on the futures contract, which is what everybody's got their eye on. So we're right on the edge of that breakout above 2,800. I would be surprised if we don't get it in the next few days, but so far we're running into resistance there. As you say, the NASDAQ breaking above it is probably a good indication as to what might come. But Patrick, the bigger question is not, is it this the week or is it not until next week or the week after that we break through 2,800? The real question in my mind is, then what? Pippa Malmgren is going to describe a scenario which she thinks could be a bullish setup for a summer rally. So it'll be interesting to see if that plays out. Stay tuned for the feature interview in order to get more perspective on why Pippa sees potentially a bullish setup here. Meanwhile, Patrick, let's come back to this in the postgame before we get into your predictions, because I'd like to get your perspective not only on the predictions that you made, but also how they play into your current outlook on the S&P. So let's come back to it at the end of the feature interview with Pippa Malmgren.
All right, well, let's move on to the U.S. dollar index, because it looked like last week that we were beginning some sort of a correction. I was thinking that, a natural retracement could have easily seen us down to the 93 handle on the dollar index. But just like that, the dollar is back up towards 95 and teasing for a 95 breakout. And then you have major currencies like the Japanese yen already badly breaking. What's your thinking on the dollar index? Is this still a consolidation or are we already setting up for another big leg higher?
Well, it remains to be seen. I definitely feel like it wants to be another leg higher. The thing is, this resistance at 95 has been pretty formidable. We are making another push up towards it this afternoon, and really all week we've been pushing up, first getting back above 94, now edging closer to 95. We need the closing print above 95 that stays there for a couple of days. That's the signal that tells us that we're really headed higher. We haven't seen it yet. So I think it's coming. I think the ingredients are there, short to intermediate term, for the dollar rally to continue. Now, much longer term, I still think that there is a very good bearish case, but I don't think we're there yet. I think it's a question of what's it take to get through this 95 key resistance, and we'll see where the market takes us from there.
Now, moving on to crude oil, let's start with the inventories. How did the numbers look this week?
Not only did we have a drawdown on crude oil, we had the second biggest drawdown since 2004. Crude oil drawing down 12.6 million barrels. Cushing, Oklahoma, 2.1 million barrel drawdown. Gasoline, 690,000 barrel drawdown. Distillates building 4.1 million barrels. The price reaction was a knee-jerk down at first, then a 75-cent spike up above what the price was when the data came out, but then it reversed downside again, consistent with where the original knee-jerk was, moving down at one point intraday on Thursday to a price $5 fully lower than it was earlier this week on an intraday basis. So the huge price move has been to the downside.
Okay, hold on. That sounds backwards. You said the second largest inventory draw since 2004, and that was way bigger than analysts' expectations. That would normally produce a rally. Prices usually move up when there's less inventory than expected. Do I correctly understand you? You're saying that the exact opposite happened, and if so, you got to give us an explanation. What happened here?
Well, you got it. Exactly the opposite of what you would normally expect from a really big drawdown in inventory. As far as the explanation, there's a lot of them floating around. I have my own, so I'll try to cover both the common ones as well as my own less common one. To be sure, a 12.6 million barrel drawdown should have resulted in a huge price spike higher. And in fact, it did at one point. There was a little bit of a knee-jerk down, then it did move 75 cents higher than where it had been when the data came out. That only lasted for a few minutes. Before we knew it, it was moving down, and boy, once it got going down, it kept going big time. So what the heck could be going on here that it's doing the exact opposite of what you would normally expect from the data? Well, what most people are saying, and I disagree with them, is saying, okay, it's got to be the fact that on the same morning, on Wednesday morning, the talk about the trade wars was kind of escalating. President Trump's comments were getting stronger and stronger. And at the same time, we had data coming out from OPEC saying that Saudi Arabia's production had increased dramatically in June. There was also some data out from Russia saying that it looked like they had the ability to increase considerably. They couched it to say they weren't going to do so until coordinating with their partners at OPEC, but they were signaling that they've got plenty of spare capacity to increase Russian production, as we're already seeing Saudi Arabian production increase. That has to be the explanation. Well, quite frankly, I think the reason that has to be the explanation is because the people that are saying that can't think of anything else to explain what seems to be a profoundly counterintuitive move in prices. My initial theory, which has changed a few times, frankly, since this data came out, was, okay, if I ignore the front month price, which is where a lot of panicking and volatility occurs, and look at those time spreads on the first 2 months from August to September and September to October that I've talked about so much in the last few weeks, not only did they knee-jerk down in reaction to the data, but they didn't spike up higher. They just kept going down initially. So about an hour and a half after this data had come out, with the time spreads moving down, I said, okay, I've got a theory, non-consensus, which is I think what's going on here is the market was expecting even worse. The people in the know, the people who have been bidding these time spreads for the first 2 months up to almost $3. Actually, I think September, October went over $3. August, September almost touched $3. That's totally unprecedented. It's very, very rare to see more than 50 cents of backwardation in the expiring calendar spread by the time it reaches expiration, which is still a week or so away. Now, if you look at what was going on at $3, that is a completely unprecedented world record kind of move. It would normally signal a crisis level shortage of physical oil. So all I can think of, Patrick, is although the 12.6 million barrels was really, really big, the 2.1 million barrel drawdown in Cushing, Oklahoma wasn't all that big. It was about the same as what we've seen for the last several weeks. It's the same as we saw when there were much smaller national crude drawdowns. So I think maybe people were fearing a bigger Cushing drawdown. I was really proud of this theory. It really seemed to explain so much, at least an hour after the data came out. Then what happened is, as I was formulating this and tweeting about it, all of a sudden, Patrick, we got the front month utterly collapsing in price, moving down from 73.35 or whatever the number exactly was when the data came out, all the way down to below $70 on Wednesday afternoon. I thought, boy, with that happening, those time spreads are probably utterly collapsing now. So I look at the time spreads and they're edging up even as the front month is collapsing in price. And I'm thinking, how can the time spreads be moving up? The premium, the fear that exists in the market around delivery for the next 2 months is getting a little bit worse even as the front month price collapses. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Now, it turns out that those time spreads have reversed again on Friday. They are collapsing quite a bit now. They've moved down dramatically for a while. We saw August, September below $1, which is much more in line with where it should be. It was $1.50, $1.55 yesterday. So it looks like maybe that theory is still back on, but I'll say in general, Patrick, I don't think most of the pundits know. They're guessing. They're saying, well, it must be about trade war tensions. It must be about this announcement from OPEC. Hey, the announcement from OPEC came out long before the inventory data did. This massive collapse of price happened in reaction to the inventory data. Now, maybe people thought that it should happen because of the OPEC news and they were waiting for inventory just in case before they started selling. That's a weak argument, but it's plausible. In any case, after inventory came out, an inventory report that would normally be super bullish was interpreted super bearish by the market. The best explanation I can come up with is people in the know were expecting a bigger physical drawdown in Cushing, Oklahoma than they got.
All right, just before we move on to gold, though, I had to ask you about Brent because Brent slammed $5.50 down today, down almost 7%. And the spread now between West Texas and Brent has now narrowed to just $3. I mean, remember, we were just talking about a couple weeks ago, $11 spread. That's just gone. Like, what happened here? Do you have any explanation for this?
Well, I do have a little bit of explanation. It doesn't make me look super smart because, frankly, the action in Brent tends to invalidate parts of what I just said. The theory that I was starting to work towards, Patrick, is, okay, ask yourself the question, why is WTI falling off a cliff and crashing? I know the reason. Whatever this physical market squeeze situation was that was pushing the time spreads to ridiculous numbers, that must be ending. Whatever it was, even though I don't think we ever really figured out the true cause, it must be ending. And so, therefore, what we can expect is a local in WTI only, not extending to Brent. We should expect to see the price come down dramatically, but Brent to hold strong because Brent was not experiencing this massive time spread blowout that we saw in the first 2 months of WTI. Brent didn't do that. Brent did collapse even more than WTI collapsed. That doesn't jibe with the idea that this was all about whatever was driving the WTI time spreads. So there's a lot of moving parts here. There's more to this than meets the eye. That's the part I can say confidently. I don't think it's as simple as the messages you hear from most of the pundits. It's about trade wars. It's about OPEC, news briefs. There's more going on here. I haven't completely figured it out, but what I can say is the action in Brent kind of blows the theory that this was all about whatever had been driving the time spreads in WTI.
Well, the interesting technical observation I would quickly make before we move on to gold is the fact that time spread blowout on WTI caused the West Texas to blow to a higher high, but Brent actually just retested its $80 highs, and that became a huge overhead resistance. Wouldn't it be interesting if Brent was already putting a bigger topping formation in and that West Texas was just temporarily popping above? We'll find out. But anyway, I want to move on to gold because gold has actually been very weak. even in spite of the dollar taking a break, we find ourselves earlier in the day even testing very close to the 1240 level on the downside. And so it seems like gold cannot catch a bid. I've always tried to be a little bit optimistic on this turning around, but it really seems to be a very heavy distribution here. What's your thinking on gold?
Well, I don't know. It seems to me that the action we're seeing in gold is pretty consistent with what I would expect based on the dollar. We saw a push up last week that got us to, 1265 or so. People were thinking that the dollar was maybe ready to roll over and tank. The dollar didn't roll over, and gold reversed course immediately, and now it's been weak, and it's back down to, kind of looks like a double bottom, back down to where it was July 3rd, I think, was the previous recent low. We were testing prices within about a dollar and a half of that same level early this morning, and we're seeing a little bit of bounce here. I think really what gold's doing is it's waiting to see what the dollar does next. So I think if you're interested in the direction of gold, you've got to ask yourself what the scoop is on the dollar. If you think that we're in a topping process on the dollar and it's about to roll over dramatically to the downside, use this dip, buy your gold. I don't think that. I think that the dollar is likely to break above 95, and because we have seen such a stall here trying to get through 95, when we do get a clean break above 95, I think there will be some acceleration upside on the dollar. That ought to set up the acceleration to the downside on gold. But I think the dollar is the driver. I think gold is following.
No, I agree with that view. The dollar is the driver, and that's been the case all year. Anyway, I want to move on to these 10-year Treasury yields because just in the last week, we've saw an incredibly tight range. The price action is incredibly weak from a yield perspective. It's still hovering at the bottom of the range, but we haven't seen any bad break to the downside. We're at like 285 as we speak. Do you think this still breaks down lower?
You know, it's going to be very interesting to see. We're at the bottom of that narrow trading range around 280 or so. There's another support level lower around 260. I kind of have a feeling that we are going to get to a test of that 260 level before this is over. It seems like that's where you would really hit a lot of stops and you would shake out the people that were so convinced that once it got to 305, it was going to be just all uphill in terms of yield and downhill in terms of price. So I think that there is an argument for a little bit of a Treasury rally into the summer. We'll see how it plays out. I don't really have any strong opinion, though, about what the short-term direction is. The place where I do have a strong opinion is when you see a clean break either south of 260 or north of 310. I think that's where the next really big structural move in the market starts to happen, and I would not be at all surprised if it's not until September or so before we start to see a significant move in one direction or the other.
Now, Eric, before we move on to the feature interview, Macro Voices Live in Toronto on August 10th is already sold out, but the event itself keeps getting better and better. Why don't you give us an update this week?
Well, Patrick, as you say, the event is totally sold out. So if you didn't get your ticket, sorry, you've missed it. We'll probably do another one of these someday. This one's gone. What we are going to do, though, we got so much feedback that what people like the most about this is the meet and greet that we've got at the end to give us a chance to meet you face to face, talk to you, find out what you like about Macro Voices, also give you a chance to meet all of the speakers one-on-one. We've got that. It's a little over an hour that we have reserved for that. We decided it may not be enough time. So optionally, we are adding a dinner party, an after party, if you will, after the event at a nearby restaurant. It's $25 extra, which is what it cost us to reserve our own private room in the restaurant and also to cover the speakers' meals. You still have to buy your own dinner off of the menu and pay for your own drinks. So the $25 is just admission. That's $25 Canadian. And that gets you into the dinner party after Macro Voices Live. We're going to put each speaker at a different table so that whoever you found most interesting during the course of the day, hopefully you'll get a chance to have a conversation with over dinner. So that, if you are already registered for Macro Voices Live, you can expect an email in the next couple of days that will tell you how to sign up. If you're interested, move fast because the restaurant has limited seating. We can't get everybody in, so you're going to have to move quickly before that one sells out as well.
This week's featured interview guest is Dr. Pippa Malmgren, former advisor to 2 presidents and now consultant to the UK government, plus the founder of DPRM Group. Eric's interview with Pippa is coming up as Macro Voices continues, right here at macrovoices.com.
And now with this week's special guest, here's hedge fund manager Eric Townsend.
Joining me next on the program is Dr. Pippa Malmgren, the founder of DRPM Group and the author of a new book which won't be out until October. We'll get to that later in the interview. Pippa, I want to start with the trade wars. China. Obviously, you are well known as a geopolitical analyst, having served as an advisor to several U.S. presidents. So tell us about your perspective. Is Donald Trump bluffing with Xi about this trade war stuff? Is this all part of the art of the deal stuff? Are we really at the risk that appears to exist of a major trade war breaking out that could cause, some people think, a meltdown in the stock market? What's the real story here, and what are the various actors up to? What's their real intention?
Well, I'm very lucky at this time. I have a bit of a frontline view because of my role advising the British government on trade policy right now. But I've spent my whole career in trade, and what we're seeing now is something so profoundly different from anything we've ever seen before. You can't even put it into context. You just have to understand it on its own terms. So the first thing is, yes, it's very much an art of the deal situation. And the way Xi Jinping sees it is Trump is the first president ever who is willing to give away territory in exchange for what he wants. That's what he did with Ukraine and Syria. He said to the Russians, it's complicated. We're not interested in that part of the world. And if you would give us some other stuff, then we'll let you have that. And that's exactly what happened. So Xi is going, wow, this may be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get North Korea to effectively, and I'll use a bold term, soft annex it in the same way that the Russians soft annexed Ukraine. So the question is, what does Xi want? What does Trump want? What Trump wants is to remove the whole nuclear threat. And to be fair, he will want a Nobel Prize to be awarded to somebody, but it won't be to him. It'll be to the North and the South Korean leaders. Nonetheless, this is only possible because of his changed stance. And what does Xi want? Xi wants to have North Korea much more under his control and all the strategic value that brings, not to mention the commercial value, because, North Korea is a big mining location, and it has a very, very important port location that is critical to China at a time they're building out their so-called Belt and Road, which is this global infrastructure of connectivity that connects China with the rest of the world by railways, by ports, by bridges, by highways, etc., and through digital infrastructure. So both sides are throwing everything onto the table. Both sides are saying, well, I have a gripe about this. And the other guy goes, well, this other issue is bugging me. So the Chinese are putting the South China Sea and saying, okay, we'll sort the North Korean nuclear issue if you give us North Korea and you let us have South China Sea without any more complaining. And Trump is saying, okay, you fix North Korea, but by the way, could you invest some of that capital from the Belt and Road in the United States as well? And could you please do something about the fact that your trade deficit issue with us is so severe? So they're kind of throwing things back and forth at each other. The more recent thing is Xi saying, and Chinese firms have been locked out of the U.S. market because of your ban on technology transfer. Could you please lift that? And Trump saying, well, I'm not going to lift that unless you do this other stuff first. So it's very confusing for people who are from the world of foreign policy, because what they're used to is the State Department negotiating this kind of thing. That's how it's always been done on North Korea before. This time, both sides are lifting it way above the level of their diplomats and doing it directly. And I can't emphasize strongly enough, directly. People haven't clocked. The U.S. ambassador to China is Governor Branstad. Now, why is Governor Branstad important? Because when Xi Jinping went to the United States to learn English and to learn about American farming and agriculture, who became his closest personal friend? Governor Branstad. Who is the back channel in Washington that talks to the Chinese ambassador? Ivanka Trump. So you have to remember, the Chinese love this because this is how they're used to doing business. They always do business through friends and family. They're like, forget the diplomats, the official civil service. We go way over them in China. Same thing here. So they kind of like the way Trump is doing this. And as a result, it's very difficult for all of us general observers to see what's happening. It's almost like Wimbledon happening with no cameras. And the only people who can see what's going on are the ones that are actually on courtside. So this means it's very difficult for outsiders to really comprehend what's happening. But I think the end result is going to be this. They will reach a deal. Probably North Korea will end up much more in Chinese control than ever before. The U.S. will claim victory because the North Korean nuclear issue will be diminished. The North Koreans will actually be, for the first time, in a position to generate foreign direct investment into North Korea, and they're already reaching out to create international consortia of investors because they're afraid of the Chinese owning everything. So suddenly North Korea will genuinely open up. And you'll see mining and the port all become frontline issues in the markets. And the bottom line is this geopolitical threat that everybody was so worried about will actually get resolved. But the price will be they had to throw a lot of sand and grit in the gears of the world economy by hurling around threats of trade actions. So I'm not saying there's no residue from those threats, but I am saying they're all betting it's worth it to get to this much bigger goal.
Now, if what you're saying is true, and I suspect that it is, because certainly my perception of this has been that Trump, when he says, trade wars are a good thing that are easy to win, I don't think he's so naive as to believe that. I think that he knows that taking a very outspoken stance like that is part of his style of negotiating, and it's part of a dance that they're doing. Now, if we're right about that, it seems to me that it really sets up what could be a really big rally in the stock market when this gets resolved, because a lot of people are, they're taking these things literally. They are fearing when Donald Trump says trade wars are a good thing and are easy to win. Some people think that he actually believes that and that is really going to get hurt badly when he finds out they're not so easy to win. So if you're right, does that set up a massive rally where there's a relief and everybody says, oh my gosh, we're not really going to have a trade war after all? Everything's great, and we go to new all-time highs on the stock market?
I think that this is a scenario we should definitely be thinking about. And let's add to this scenario that both sides are going to be in a position to say we've thrown all of our dirty laundry on the table. We have come to an agreement about the whole darn thing, and they basically clear the stage for the next, call it 20 years. That's a real possibility, that Chinese and the Americans, after all this shouting, actually say, well, you know what? We do have a deal. And it's not just on North Korea. It's on high tech. It's on the South China Sea. It's on whether we're going to bug the Chinese about their increasing military presence in Africa and the Middle East. They come to some kind of general arrangement, and suddenly the two sides are holding hands. Everything calms down. Yeah, definitely. The market is going to have priced in something very, very negative, and what actually happens is something potentially positive. Now, again, I don't want to say that I approve of this strategy, right? I mean, this is a president who basically began this whole thing by threatening North Korea with a full nuclear strike. Right? Nobody can forget. That's how this started. And only when he threatened that did the Chinese and the North Koreans all go, okay, let's sit down and chat. Now, part of what's happened here, if you look at it really carefully, if you unpack everything, you'll also find, for example, the steel tariffs have been, let's say, implemented in such a way that the country that's the most damaged is not China, it's Germany. Now, why do the United States and China want to gang up on Germany? That is partly because the Chinese are now competing nose to nose with the Germans, right? Because the Chinese aren't anymore in the business of making cheap toys. They're out of that. They are now making fast railway links, very high-speed bullet trains, very high-tech manufactured goods. They are competing directly with the Germans in all of these areas. And if the Chinese want to hurt their competition, an easy way to do it is you get the president to announce steel tariffs that actually, in the end, hit the Germans hardest. And that was, I think, intentional. On the American side, even Obama was having trouble with the Germans for a variety of reasons, but under Trump, much more so. And his big gripe is basically that Germany's not holding its end up on the defense spending, but that also they're generally obstructive to most of the things that he believes in. And it's true. It's very hard to reconcile how the German political leadership view things versus how Trump views things. And so anything that he can do to hurt the Germans is okay in his book. So suddenly you also have an alignment between Trump and the Chinese when it comes to being tough on the Germans. And I would look at every single trade announcement with that angle. Forget if it's aimed, it looks like it's aimed at China. But probably if you unpack the thing, you find out that actually the country that will get hurt the most will be Germany.
I want to come back to North Korea and Kim Jong-un specifically. I've heard such a range of viewpoints. Some people have said, look, Kim Jong-un is basically a puppet for China. Anything that he says, he's saying because China told him to. This whole kerfuffle between the United States and Korea is a proxy. It exists as China's way to, impose threats or to negotiate with the United States government. The other side of the argument is no, Kim Jong-un is totally hell-bent on his own position as essentially a dictator of a nuclear-capable country who sincerely means that he intends to, send nuclear missiles to bomb Hawaii or whatever the threat happens to be on a given day. How do you see this? Is North Korea really the renegade, wild threat to world peace and to the United States that it has appeared to be, or is it really just China's negotiating arm?
So, two things. One is North Korea is not a state in the way that we usually think about a state. It really is a cult of a personality. So the cult of that personality is this current leader, and it was his father before that. And the father and the son are very, very different. They're not at all the same thing. So when we talk about North Korea, we have to understand we're really talking about an individual personality. The current leader does seem to be a lot more switched on and sensible than the father, and is basically trying to preserve something as opposed to end up with nothing. So he's doing something we haven't seen North Korea do before, which is to negotiate rationally. And I remember talking once with Bob Gallucci. He was one of my teachers at Georgetown University. He'd been the nuclear arms negotiator with North Korea under Jimmy Carter, which is when this whole game started. And the Americans said, you can build the light water reactors if you promise not to build the big stuff. Anyway, Bob Gallucci used to say, everybody assumes that they're rational, but they're not. You're in negotiation, and suddenly they start saying stuff that's against their own position. They'll negotiate against themselves. So this is a thing. They're not really part of the modern world community, and they don't think the same way. So that's one issue. The second issue is I was once very privileged to spend about 5 hours with Helmut Schmidt, the former chancellor of Germany, who had laid the groundwork for the reunification of East and West Germany. And I was, it was like I was in graduate school. I was between jobs, and I got this gig writing for a magazine called The International Economy. And I wrote to him and said, I'd like to come interview you about the possibility of reunification of North and South Korea. And he wrote back and said, listen, no, I don't do any interviews on the reunification of East and West Germany, but nobody ever asked me about this other thing, and I'm advising the South Koreans, and I'd be delighted, so come to Hamburg. So I went and sat with him in his office, and he was super famous for chewing tobacco and spitting it pretty much across the room, which I tell you for sure, that's exactly what he did. It was absolutely disgusting and totally fascinating. And he walked me through the situation, and he said the following. He said, look, with East and West Germany, at least the East Germans understood the concept of you get up in the morning, you go to work, you earn a paycheck, and on the way home you buy a beer with the money that you made. This is not the case in North Korea. People there don't work for a paycheck. They work to not be killed. The reason you're alive is because you are in a position of total submission to the leader and only one person, which is the ultimate leader. So they have no sense of a work ethic or how labor normally has any negotiating power. I mean, nothing. So the big issue for all the neighbors for decades and decades and decades has been no one wants any refugees because these people are impossible to manage. And they've been taught that foreigners want to basically kill your children and eat them for breakfast and dreadful, terrible things. So you have a kind of warped psychology in conjunction with a complete lack of understanding of the value of human labor. And therefore, integrating them into the world is going to be hard. So today, when China says, we'll do that in exchange for getting control and exchange for removing the nuclear issue, we will take on the responsibility for integrating these people into society. And everybody's kind of like, that's a pretty good deal. And even the North Korean leader is going, well, if you're going to do that, there's some hope that I might survive that process and still have a voice, still have money, still have a part to play. And that's why Xi Jinping summoned him to Beijing twice, the first time he's ever left the country, the North Korean leader. And he went right away because he understands this is where his bread's going to get buttered. So when you say, rational, logical, there's such a crazy set of circumstances here that it's very difficult to assess it on any normal grounds. That's why I say the context is so different from anything we're used to looking at.
Let's move to Russia, which is the other really big geopolitical hot basket, if you will. It's interesting to me, Pippa, that there's been so much talk about how awful these things that have occurred in Syria have been, the chemical attacks and so forth, and the U.S. was forced to act, and the missiles and the whole bit. The whole while, Russia was saying it's all fake, it never happened, and that seemed hard to believe. Well, I noticed that the OPCW, the Organization of Prevention of Chemical Warfare, just came out with a report saying, guys, it seems like Russia might have been right on that one. There's no evidence of any chemical weapons having been used here. And the whole sarin story that the U.S. government had used as justification for that Tomahawk missile attack maybe never happened, according to some independent parties. So what's going on? Who's right, if that's clear to you, and where are the risks in terms of, regardless of who's right, both sides seem pretty darn strong in their positions, and the rhetoric, I don't think, has ever been louder. I don't remember any time during my lifetime, I grew up during the latter half of the Cold War, or the end of the Cold War. I don't remember Russia and the United States ever talking at each other quite as aggressively as what I've heard in the last several weeks.
Yeah, and then there's another angle on this, which is, of course, the chemical weapons allegations that are here in the United Kingdom, where we've had now 2 incidents, one with the Skripal family, the father and daughter, and more recently with a British couple who seem to have come in contact with the same Novichok agent. And similarly, there's a big debate here about, is this real? Is this not real? Like, where's the truth? And I think the honest answer is none of us can know for sure what the situation is. Personally, I'm always going to throw my trust behind the British authorities. I just can't imagine the circumstances under which they would, make something up. But nonetheless, it's a big open question. And I think it's part of a much bigger issue, which is that the battle between Russia and the West is no longer being fought in traditional means. It's not about submarines and aircraft carriers, although they are still being used, and we're still seeing lots of air incursions, submarine incursions. The Russians are constantly threatening to dredge up the internet cables that are under the sea, to be disruptive. So it's not that it's a zero, but that's not where the real action is. The real action is on 2 different fronts that are related, and it's all about technology. The new space race, and it's between the U.S., China, and Russia, is for who has the most computational power. Because computational power is what permits you to do what happened with Cambridge Analytica, to get the story out that you want to get out. It's the thing that allows you to influence people with your angle of what is reality versus somebody else's angle of what is reality. So, it's information conflict and war rather than physical conflict and war. Although, having said that, we are seeing lots of actual traditional military events. The Russians are being very active, for example, in the Baltics, and wasn't that many months ago they practiced seizing an island in Norway called Svalbard, which is where the International Space Station operations are managed out of, and a whole lot of other things are happening in Svalbard that have defense meaning, and they kind of decided to have a go at potentially seizing that location. And of course, that would have invoked NATO Clause 5 and created a big issue. So anyway, there's a lot going on between the 2 sides. I don't know how we can parse apart who's right and who's wrong. What we can know is that the two sides are going to keep accusing each other of stuff, and the two sides are going to keep defending themselves, and I expect this to become much louder over time. So for investors, the question is, what are they going to do about all this? And I think the honest answer is the risk that this turns into something that an investor genuinely has to take into consideration are not that high, because nobody really wants to take it to that place. And frankly, if we end up in a situation where everybody's genuinely talking about a nuclear exchange, your portfolio is going to be the last thing you're worried about, right? I mean, you can't really plan for that eventuality. What you can do is say the risks of being involved in places that are affected by this is too high. And I would name some places. Like, if I were investing in the oil and gas, particularly natural gas discoveries in the Eastern Mediterranean, I would say, that's got a big geopolitical risk, because the Russians have said, basically, we don't want that developed. We're going to have a permanent naval presence in the Mediterranean and parentheses to make sure it isn't developed. I would say that's a major geopolitical risk to that investment. And Israel's got a lot of money backed on that being developed. A lot of the neighboring countries are arguing about who's going to get the cash flow. So that's a good practical example. I would be betting everybody's going to spend a lot more money on computational power. This race for who can calculate the most stuff is going to persist. And I would be betting there's going to be some good knock-on effects from that. As governments spend money on that, private sectors tend to benefit. It's a bit like the new version of building the internet. Suddenly they put all the money into the infrastructure, and the general public starts to learn how to benefit from that infrastructure. So, I think it's noisy, but I don't see it as an obstacle to markets continuing to do what they're doing, which is basically finding ways to go up, to value assets more highly.
I would definitely want to come back to the technology aspects of this, because I think it's really fascinating. But before we do that, on the subject of Russia, Sergey Glazyev has been credited as kind of the mastermind of this de-dollarization strategy to try to persuade other BRICS countries to abandon the dollar. From what I understand, Mr. Glazyev has recently been appointed formally as an advisor to President Vladimir Putin. Previously, he's a very interesting character in Russia. He's somewhat controversial in his views, but he's a scholar in a university. Now he is formally advising the president. And he did an interview recently in English, which I thought was fascinating. We shared that with our Macro Voices listeners a couple of weeks ago in the Research Roundup email. But he says some very, very strong things in that video. He says, look, what the United States is doing is an act of financial terrorism. They're using their control of the SWIFT payment system, which is the international wire transfer system, as a tool to enforce sanctions that are not even approved of by the UN and which are specifically disapproved of by a lot of other countries. An example of that is cutting Iran off and using the SWIFT system as a tool to impose sanctions on Venezuela. And what Mr. Glazyev is saying is it is way past time for the rest of the world to recognize these acts for what they are, which he says are financial terrorism, and to take action to protect the rest of the world. He sees it as a defense mechanism, not an aggressive action, but a defense mechanism to protect other countries from acts of financial terrorism, as he puts it, perpetrated by the United States. And it seems to me, the part that he thinks all these things is not news to me. I've been following his work for a long time. I know that he holds these views, but he's just been formally appointed as an advisor to Vladimir Putin at a time when it seems like maybe there is a lot of building consensus and a lot of critical mass building around other countries in the world to say, hey, maybe it's time for us to design another payment system. And it really makes me think of you, because you and I have talked about digital currencies before. It seems to me like the opportunity is so ripe for them to say, let's design a new world reserve currency, which is a fully digital currency. It has some of the benefits of the cryptocurrencies, but it is more centralized. It's controlled by the government, and it replaces the U.S. dollar. So he achieves his de-dollarization goal and he eliminates the risk that he sees by the U.S. having a monopoly on the payment system through SWIFT, all at the same time. What do you think? Do you think they're up to something like that? And if so, would they partner with China to do it? Would they be doing it on their own in secret? How would it come out? Because he never publicly talks about any kind of digital currency. He doesn't say a word about it, but that almost makes me wonder what they're up to.
Right. So the first thing is, this is exactly the argument that I made in my last book, Signals, how everyday signs can help us navigate the world's turbulent economy. And I was basically saying that the way the rest of the world, particularly the Chinese and the Russians, but frankly the Europeans as well, the way they see things is the post-war international rules of the game when it came to the world economy. The organizations like the World Bank and the IMF, the rules like the World Trade Organization system, these had been established so that everybody got a fair shot at a decent outcome, that the whole thing wasn't skewed in the direction of any one player. It was meant to let everybody compete, and basically the best country wins, as it were, in every category of trade and policy and whatever. And the perception has been that in the last decade or so, particularly since the financial crisis, the U.S. has chosen to skew the rules of the game in their direction at everybody else's expense. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that view, but I believe that view is very strongly held by particularly the Chinese and the Russians. And both sides are saying, you know what, let's just create our own rules and our own organizations. For example, the Chinese tried to say, well, if we make a bigger contribution to the World Bank and the IMF, then we want more representation. And the U.S. basically said, no way. So they're like, fine, we'll just create our own, which is the new Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is underpinning all of this Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure build-out. When the sanctions went in on the Russians and the U.S. said, we're going to cut you guys out of SWIFT, that's exactly what the Russians said is, wait a minute, I thought SWIFT was a neutral international organization that facilitated payments. It wasn't meant to be used for political purposes. So if you're going to use it for that purpose, then we'll just create our own system, a separate one. And that's exactly what they're doing. So again, I'm not saying I agree with the Russian or the Chinese perception of reality, but I concede that that is their perception of reality, and they're working very hard to create alternatives to what we have in the West and what we've traditionally relied upon. I think that the American side doesn't get this because, well, I'm American and I've worked for now 2 presidents. I'm working now in the British government. And what I see is there's a tendency to think that our way is the right way and this should be completely obvious to everyone else. But it isn't. And so we're in a situation where the rest of them are going, you know what? Technology permits us to build alternatives. We don't have to be in your system anymore. And frankly, the way the system is working is becoming so much more demanding in terms of paperwork, all the know your customer, all of which I support. But the rest of the world is going, wait a minute, I'm not even doing a money transfer that involves the United States. I'm moving money from 2 other countries and I still have to comply with the U.S. system. Maybe I'd rather look at a Russian alternative or a Chinese alternatives. In other words, there's a market for what they're proposing. Now that's connected to this de-dollarization approach, which they had already begun separately from what I'm arguing. But the two come together. And I do think that they're trying to create a world where they diminish the need for people to hold dollars. The lucky break that we have is that as the Chinese and the Russians sell dollars, which they are, who's picking them up? The answer is all the U.S. pension funds, because they're all underfunded. They don't have the right asset liability matching. We don't have long-term treasuries anymore, so they can't buy treasuries. They have to buy them secondarily off the Russians and the Chinese as they sell. So we haven't felt pain of higher interest rates as a function of these foreign holders selling treasuries. That's a lucky break that we happen to be in a moment of history where all our pension funds desperately need those assets, not for betting purposes, but just because they got to match the assets and the liabilities. How long that lasts is another question. In the meantime, yes, they are building a world that will not be so dependent on the United States. And the question is, What does that really mean for the world economy? Is that truly a threat to the United States, or actually does it not really make that much difference if you have investors from Africa investing in Russian mining that never touches a dollar, that they can do all of that in rubles or in Chinese yuan? It's an interesting question, and it's an open question. I know the market's playing with that question, but I don't think the answer is so completely obvious yet.
Pippa, you are best known as a geopolitical analyst, obviously having advised 2 U.S. presidents, now working in the British government system. That's what people think of you as being an expert on. Most people would never think that I would ask you high-tech questions about Silicon Valley and what's going on and so forth. But as we discussed off the air, you really think that the new era of geopolitics and finance, how does geopolitics affect markets? It really is going to be about what's going on with social media and technology. So please elaborate first on why you think that. Why is it that someone like yourself who focuses on geopolitics and how it affects financial markets would care about something like Facebook and what they're up to? And tell us what you've learned and what your feelings are about the things that are going on there.
Sure. Well, I think, look, President Putin put it best. He said artificial intelligence is the new frontier of geopolitics. And I think he's right. He's absolutely right. And a couple of times in this interview, I've talked about this new space race for computational power. Let me now elaborate what I mean, because whoever has the greatest capacity to compute has the greatest capacity to break everybody else's codes. And it doesn't matter whether they're nuclear codes or they're the password for your Facebook account or your password for your Bitcoin account. All of them are just codes to be broken. So all sides are now in this massive race. So the Chinese are building a huge facility in Anhui province, which it is said when they're completed in 3 years' time, it will literally have 1 million times the computational capability of the entire planet today. I mean, that's a hell of a thing to think about. But the Americans, we just announced a few weeks ago, our new supercomputer, which, by the way, we house at Oak Ridge, which is where we keep nuclear facilities. So this is important. It's considered on a par with our most secret nuclear weapons. We are keeping this new thing. It's called Summit. And just to give you an idea of the computational capability, it's said that it can do what a human would take 6.3 billion years to do. That's with a B. It can do in 1 second. So when we talk about computational capacity, that's what we're talking about. So the Russians, the Americans, and the Chinese are all focused on getting the biggest grunt, which is why quantum computing is now a geopolitical issue, and everybody's racing because that's just pure grunt. That's just X many calculations to the power of fill in the blank. It's not that quantum computers do the same thing as supercomputers. They're very, very different. They can't do all the same things. They can do other things. But the main thing is just the pace at which they operate is so much faster. So, again, why is this important? It's important because once you can break all the codes, you can begin to gather data and understand what is happening on your opponent's side. This famous saying that's going around that data is the new oil. Well, it is. It genuinely is. So if we look at the case of Cambridge Analytica, which I think is just the bare tip of an iceberg, they didn't even hack, right? They just had access to all of the Facebook likes of roughly 81 million people. And from those Facebook likes that they didn't steal, they just had access to them, they were able to compile a psychometric profile of every one of those 1 million people and create 5,000 data points about each one of those individuals based on that one input. Well, today we live in a world where you are giving away data about yourself far beyond when you click on a Facebook like. And it's in the form of, for example, look at the most valuable artificial intelligence startup in the world. It's called SenseTime. It's a Chinese company. What they have, it's worth, I think, last time I looked, $3 billion US as a startup. what it can do is canvass a crowd of 10,000 people and identify not only every individual in that crowd, and this was the technology that was recently used to arrest the guy who went to the rock concert in China that had 60,000 people attending, and they found him out of the entire crowd and went straight to his seat and said, Mr. So-and-so, you are under arrest, right? Because they can identify everybody. But it can also identify the emotional state of every individual in that crowd of 10,000. Now, that's incredibly valuable because that's what Cambridge Analytica was able to do. Identify the emotional state. How do you feel about Donald Trump? How do you feel about Hillary Clinton? And begin to then hit you with messages that would push your position based on that emotional state. And so, you could sell anybody anything. If you know their emotional state, you can sell them a political position. You can sell them a refrigerator. I mean, every company in the world wants access to this because they can sell you stuff and you're pretty much helpless because they know where your hot buttons are. Now, take this a step further, just so we really understand what this means. This is the same technology that now is used that when a chief executive goes on CNBC Squawk Box in the morning to talk about his company, this is the technology that is capturing the facial movements of that CEO, what they call the microfacial movements, and those reveal when you are lying. And now we set the algorithm to short your stock the minute that those algorithms detect that you're lying. So while you are still on air on CNBC Squawk Box, the algorithms are shorting your stock because your little microfacial movement revealed that you're lying about some aspect of the company. So that's the world that we're in, and all of these nations at the level of government understand how much power you have if you have this insight. And that's where the real geopolitical fight is taking place. It's over data. It's not, the old land battle situation. It's a data battle. And that's why if you're in markets, technology is not this cool, interesting thing on the side. This is at the heart of not just markets, but at the heart of geopolitics as well. Technology is now a central defining feature of the geopolitical landscape as opposed to something quite separate. And I think that's why, when Zuckerberg went in front of Congress to do his testimony, which I thought he handled remarkably well given the sort of stupidity of the questions, right? I mean, clearly Congress has no idea how Facebook operates, how technology operates. They totally revealed their lack of understanding. And there have been a lot of spoofs on that all over the internet. But what is important is I'm not sure Zuckerberg really appreciated until he was in that position that he is not running some private sector organization. He is running effectively a public entity. And I don't think Silicon Valley has registered the public role that they are all now playing. Because they're like, no, it's just my little company, right? I'm just Twitter. I'm just this. I'm just that. But no, it's at the heart of geopolitics now. So I think this is really important for investors to understand. And I've got a big chapter in my upcoming book on leadership that's just about how to navigate in this new data-driven environment because it's very, very different from the past. The last thing I'll say about this is, in military history, we used to have, if you remember, Alfred Thayer Mahan talked about sea power, and Harold Mackinder back in the mid 1800s talked about land power. And then, World War II was won on air power, and World War I as well. Well, now we're in a period of data power. That is the new geopolitics. And that's why, if you are interested in markets or geopolitics, you can't treat tech as some other subject, because it isn't anymore.
This is really fascinating, Pippa, and the thing that has been so striking to me about the Cambridge Analytica story is just how people are getting so wound up and bent out of shape over what seems to me like a trivial, tiny, eensy, teensy, weeny, little, small example of what kind of abuse the pump is primed to cause to occur. That was just not a big deal. Now, if you look at what social media is, and a lot of people have been saying this for more than a decade, if a product that's as cool as Facebook or Twitter is free, what that means, and this goes back to the famous Warren Buffett quote, if you're sitting at the poker table and you're not sure who the sucker is, then you're the sucker. And if it is free, then that means the real product is your personal data. And, this is the reason that I've refused to participate in Facebook. But we're getting to a point, though, Pippa, where it is so cool. I'm not stupid. I understand that by using Twitter, somebody is keeping track of what time I'm awake, where I am. They're tracking my IP address. They know exactly where I'm located, what I'm doing, what times I wake up, and what subjects interest me. And they're tracking me, and they're using it in ways that I can't even imagine. But you know what? Twitter is so cool, I can't resist using it because it gives me access to smart people that are interested in what I'm interested in. So I go ahead and I do it anyway. And I guess what it really makes me wonder is, how would we ever get to the point of there being some justice, some system of regulation or laws that protect us so that things can't be used in inappropriate ways? How could we ever get there if, first of all, most people don't even understand how big the problem is? And second of all, even if they did, as you just said, it's very, very clear that lawmakers are absolutely unqualified to know what to do with this. Even if they wanted to try to enact some kind of privacy laws to protect inappropriate use of social media data, they wouldn't have any idea where to start. Where do you see this all going? Because it seems to me that eventually everyone's life is, every aspect of your being is knowable through your social media. And as the social media gets better and better, it gets harder and harder to resist, and everybody's on it. Where is this all leading?
Well, this is the topic of this one chapter in my next book where I talk about the data sphere. And what I mean is, first you have to understand that you are emitting data even if you're not using social media. So this is way beyond social media. When you watch the movies at home or in the cinema, increasingly the screens have cameras embedded in them because why bother with a test audience if you can see a live audience reaction to something? And they'll say, oh, but it's just generic. We're just capturing the emotional reaction of the people who live in this postcode. So it's not about you personally. And so you may say, well, I still don't like it, but at least it's not about me. And then you're using a vacuum cleaner. These little robot vacuum cleaners, they're round, that go around your living room and vacuum by themselves. Well, what are they doing? They're broadcasting the dimensions of your living room, the human footfall, and the time of day that happens. So far, they're not broadcasting audio, but increasingly devices are. So, for example, the Amazon Echo has already been subpoenaed in a murder trial. And initially, Amazon said, no, this is private data. And then 2 weeks later, they handed it over because it is a witness in a murder trial. And it's a reliable witness because it heard the conversation and recorded it. So imagine pretty much all the time when you go to the department store and you walk past the Giorgio Armani counter, the cameras are capturing your reaction to what you see so that the company can understand how should we change the advertising and make it more attractive to you. Now, in the past, these were all independent silos, and each company could say, it's just generic. But what artificial intelligence does is it connects the dots between the silos. So it doesn't take long to figure out that it was you at the movie theater, and specifically you, and this is your emotional reaction, and you also bought popcorn while you were there, and you're using a Fitbit, and you're supposed to be on a diet, but you're breaking the diet by eating the popcorn. It begins to triangulate, and it can isolate you and specifically you. Now, what we don't have is really prohibitions against this, because the only people who can buy all these silos and deploy the AI to put them together are really, really big companies. I'll give you an example. Some banks are already using this kind of approach to identify, and they can successfully identify, when a married couple is going to get divorced. They can tell from the spending patterns, and they can tell from the artificial intelligence overlay. And so what they'll do is they'll run down the credit limit of the lower earning partner, which typically is the woman. And so suddenly she's got her credit limit going down and she doesn't know why. Yeah, that's because the bank knows you are about to get divorced because your husband was buying lingerie not in your size at some shop and it's showing up on his expenditure patterns. This is that world that we're now in. So think about it as this. Facebook likes is a tiny, as you say, eensy-weensy little piece of this. Now take every kind of data that you are emitting, even the stuff you don't realize that you're emitting, and it creates millions and millions and millions of data points about you in a kind of holographic set of data points, like a sphere of data all about you. That space knows more about you than you know about yourself. And that's why some of these psychometric profiling questions that Cambridge Analytica did and that lots of other websites do, we can tell you what body type you are if you fill out this form. Well, as you fill it out, what you're doing is giving away your psychometric profile. That's very valuable to companies who buy it and then understand how to advertise to you and specifically you. So I think this is a whole new relationship between citizens and the state, between citizens and corporations. The shift in the balance of power is enormous. And I'll just finish by giving you one practical example of this, which is what we see the Chinese doing. The Chinese government, in their effort to control outcomes and prevent dissent, and, generally they'll argue, look, we got a big country with a lot of people, so we don't have the freedom that you have for human beings to go off on their own road. We kind of need everybody more in a similar, narrower space. So the way they do it is they take all these data points that I've just described, because they have everything. All the platforms, fundamentally, they all are available to the government. That's why, by the way, they banned something like the top 4,000 English language websites, like, Facebook, WhatsApp, because they only want you to operate on stuff that they have access to the data. The citizens can't access the rest of the world, so they have to go through the permitted channels. With all this data, they create effectively a score, an Uber score. Just like you get a score with Uber, now you have a Chinese government social credit score. And if that credit score falls below a certain point, you can't take a train. You can buy a ticket, but you won't be permitted onto the train. You can't fly. They say now 11 million Chinese people are prohibited from entering an aircraft and 4 million from entering a train because they are not being socially compliant. And what can make your score fall? Well, if you leave your bicycle in the footpath, points deducted. If you fail to stand for the national anthem at the football match, points deducted. If you apparently apologize insincerely, points deducted. And of course, now the technology can tell that you're apologizing insincerely because, like I said, it can identify your microfacial movements. So lying is obvious to the artificial intelligence. You can't duck and dive anymore. It's clear. And so that world where the power of government to see you with such clarity that you cannot even know about yourself, or businesses can see you with such clarity you had no idea that you were so vulnerable to being sold to in a particular way. This is a profound change in the balance of power between citizens and businesses, between citizens and their state, between businesses and the state, and between states. And so I think it almost demands a new political philosophy. We're going to have to think about what is a new legal infrastructure. Think about this. In the past, we've had insider trading laws, right? If you have inside info, you're not allowed to trade on that. What I'm talking about is insider trading, where you have so many insights into Pippa Malmgren. She has no idea that she's going to be buying stuff because she won't have any choice given what we know about her and how we're going to present it. So do I need protection as an individual from people who have much more insight into me than I have into myself? Maybe we do. And I'm, not a person who's in favor of more regulation under normal circumstances, but this is a profound change in the balance of power. And that's why I think everybody needs to pay attention. And the last thing I'll say is, all these folks who think they can escape fiat currency by wandering off into cryptocurrency land, they're going to be sorely disappointed when they find out the only person who can't remember their Bitcoin password is themselves. Because everybody else, all these governments and government entities, they're all going to know exactly because of the keystrokes, So this is not like you can escape the data sphere. We're now in it. And the question is, how are we going to govern ourselves in that space?
Well, Pippa, I have to believe that if that's just one chapter in your new book, our listeners are dying to know what the rest of the book is about. So we only have a minute before we close, but quickly, give us the story. What's the rest of the book about? When will it be available? And where can people find it when it is?
Absolutely. So the book is called The Leadership Lab, Understanding Leadership in the 21st Century. And it's from Kogan Page. It'll be out in October. And it came from, when I wrote about signals and I said that there are signals in the world economy that tell you when stuff is coming, but it's not in the data yet. It's stuff you might see with your eyes. I realized there were lots of leaders that I'm advising, government leaders, political leaders, business leaders, who keep being blindsided by things like Trump, by Brexit. And why? Because they don't see the world in the way they need to in the 21st century. So the book basically says, first, we need to have much more diversity of thinking. Everybody's working hard on diversity of people in their organizations, and I'm 100% for that. That's great. But diversity of thinking is even harder to achieve, and we've got to get more of that because the possible scenarios are so great. You just can't afford to say anymore, Trump will never win or Brexit will never happen. Yeah, now you're firmly rooted in mediocrity because you're not even considering other outcomes. A second thing is how to be more what the military calls situationally aware so that you understand what's happening. Like what I just described in terms of the data sphere, I have no doubt a lot of people are going to go, oh my gosh, I had no idea. Well, that's right. And so we need to have a better idea of what is actually happening versus what we think is happening. It's also a book about how leaders need to do less of the drilling down into any given silo, going deeper and deeper into the data, because that was a very 20th century view that if you got more data, you would get the answer. 21st century is all about the look across. It's about connecting the dots between the silos. It's about seeing the landscape. And finally, it's to say, you know what, like it or not, feelings matter as much as facts these days. We have to understand with this overload of data, people are going to start not focusing on the facts, but instead processing on an intuitive way. How do I feel? And we've got to get a lot more comfortable dealing with both that quantitative and qualitative simultaneously. So those are the key points. But we interviewed a lot of leaders and had a big conversation with them that helped form the basis for this book that I wrote with my friend Chris Lewis, who brought a male perspective advising leaders, and I brought a female perspective advising leaders.
Pippa, we're going to have to leave it there, but we'll definitely get you back on the program closer to October when the book is out and we can get into more detail about it. Patrick Serezna and I will be back as Macro Voices continues right here at macrovoices.com.
Macro Voices is a listener-driven program. Please email requests for specific future interview guests to requests@macrovoices.com. You can email questions for the program to mailbag@macrovoices.com, and we'll answer them on the air from time to time in our mailbag segment. We also welcome your suggestions for how we can improve the program. Now, back to your hosts.
Eric, what a great interview with Pippa. What was amazing to me was just the perspectives she has on how everything plays out with Trump. We've talked on this show numerous times that we thought it was really just Trump playing his game theory, the art of the deal, just this idea of setting the stage for everything in terms of how he wants to negotiate the world to look in the future. But what's really amazing is that when you hear Pippa's perspective, it really is interesting to hear the theories as to how this really plays out once everything is laid out and once all of this initial renegotiation starts and this kind of tit-for-tat tariffs are that start the negotiation process. I thought it was just amazing the way she looks at it. What did you take away from the interview?
Well, Patrick, I agree with everything that you said, and it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out, how much of it is the art of the deal, how much he's bluffing, and how much the story changes once he starts to get what he wants. And I think that sets up a feedback loop. If the market learns that once he gets what he wants, that, he was showing his teeth, but he didn't really mean it, that means that there's a discounted perception that his bark is worse than his bite, and people don't take things as seriously. And, what kind of feedback loop does that set up in the future? So it's going to be very interesting going forward. But, the part of this interview that was even more striking to me by quite a bit was toward the end, because if there's anybody in this world who is plugged in and connected to what senior policymakers in governments around the world are thinking about, it's Pippa Malmgren. And, the thing that was just so striking to me, Patrick, was when she said, look at all of the potential abuse of social media data mining. This is what is on the minds of senior leaders in government. Look, I already knew about the potential for abuse in social media data mining. That's the reason I've refused to participate in Facebook and almost all social media except for Twitter for the last 10 years. So I know all about that. But the point is, it's what is now on the minds of senior policymakers. Her quote about Vladimir Putin saying AI is where it's going to be, and whoever controls AI controls everything. That's what senior government officials are thinking about right now, and that to me is just huge. I disagree slightly on some of the technical details, but only slightly. The place where I disagree is I don't think you need quantum computing for this to get really, really scary. As a former IT professional, my background is in this kind of technology. I see big data, what IT people call the phenomenon that it's gotten just so much cheaper in recent years to build really, really big databases. The idea of being able to collect all of the information that there is about everybody and every single Google search that they've ever done and every like that they've ever had on Facebook and combine it all together and get the data from the traffic cameras and figure out their facial gestures and tie all these things together. It's mostly about massive, massive big data. That technology is here today. And so the fact that governments are really thinking about this really caught my attention. The only place where I disagree just very slightly is it sounded like Pippa thinks it's when we get quantum computers that it gets really scary. I'm really scared already based on the fact that they're even thinking about this stuff. So that was my reaction, and I just am going to be very interested to see what happens to the world going forward. We have a general political sentiment right now where most people are not concerned about privacy issues the way they used to be 30 or 40 years ago. When you had Ed Snowden come out and say, hey, the NSA is illegally spying on American citizens and doing this, that, and the other thing. Snowden was the bad guy in most people's eyes. He betrayed the trust that was placed in him to keep confidential, secret information secret, and the fact that he was exposing illegal criminal activity being undertaken by government officials didn't really upset too many people. So when I hear Pippa say senior government officials are thinking about how to use AI to really predict and anticipate what people will do, does this lead to the pre-crime scenario from whatever movie that was a few years ago where suddenly the government is arresting you for intention to do something you didn't even know you intended to do? I think it's going to be really interesting to see where this technology intersection with society takes us in the next 20 years. But Patrick, don't think that distracting me with Pippa Malmgren's theories is going to get you off the hook for being held accountable for your predictions made last year. I want to dive into that in just a minute. Listeners, you'll find the chart book that Patrick prepared in your Research Roundup email. You'll find the download link. It says Post-Game Chart Book. Before we get to the predictions, Patrick, which are coming up, I want to start with the slide you have on page 2 of the chart book, which is the S&P 500. Now, we talked in the market wrap about the short term. Give us the longer term view of where you think this thing is headed. Are we headed toward new all-time highs? Are we about to roll over here? Are we headed up toward that target zone that you have drawn in there in the high 2800s?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, just to kind of rewind a little bit, when we had that market correction that ended down in April, one of the things that we were consistently suggesting here on Macro Voice is that there's still room for a summer rally. And this summer rally just continues. When we had Luke Groman on the show just on June 21st, we did the chart book back then, and then we drew on what was a natural retracement, which was basically down to the 2,700 level, which is we marked off on this chart as the 2680 to 2710. We were buying that at Big Picture Trading. We were buying that correction, and we're long the markets here. It's very interesting that we're now attempting solidly to break out. And even as we speak, even though the S&P 500 has yet to officially break 2800, the NASDAQ has very decisively broken to a higher high, which if it continues to be the general in this bull phase, then we really already have some sort of another leg underway. Nonetheless, I think that there's plenty of room. We're still in the earlier part of July. There's plenty of room for a summer rally to still last throughout July and into August. The question really becomes, does this really gain some traction? Does this become just a key top retest and the highs are contained to the January high near 2880? Or does something really drive a tailwind to this market and break it to a higher high? And, I'm not close-minded to either scenario. My first goal, of course, is simply a retest of the highs. I think that is a very reasonable proposition at this moment for us to continue to see a rally. But I always look at things from a psychological perspective. And if you really want to get everyone long this market, you push it to a higher high. When you push it to a higher high, retail is chasing. The media gets all excited about the fact that we're at a 52-week new high in the markets and the bull markets resumed, and everyone just goes risk on. And that's usually the type of environment that puts a major top in. And so, a market that breaks above the January high, I think is still a very interesting proposition, and I'm not closing the book on that one.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head earlier, Patrick, when you said it's going to be very interesting to see if Pippa's views play out, because if it turns out that President Trump's threats about trade wars and saying they're easy to win and so forth was all just art of the deal bluffing, and he's going to take it all back and not mean it after all, I think that sets up potentially the move back to all-time highs. And as soon as you hit all-time highs, as you say, the buying begets more buying. All the bulls pile in and say, yay, we're at new all-time highs. The bull market's still intact. It was just a little correction. And maybe you get, going into August and September, you get a significant move higher. Of course, the other side of this is if it played out the other way, where we saw President Trump really hunker down and say, he meant what he said. It's not just negotiation. We're starting a trade war, and it's going full scale. That could change everything. So I think, as you say, we've got to wait this out and see what happens step by step. But Patrick, I want to move on now to something that Big Picture Trading clients saw back in the last week of December, which is your 10 predictions for 2018. And as you and I discussed back in December, we made a deal that whether it was good, bad, or indifferent, we were going to air it on the air on Macro Voices and see how you did. So let's dive in. We've got this David Letterman style, counting down from number 10, your big predictions, and let's see which ones came true, where you were right, and where you were wrong. Number 10, house prices in Canada and Australia you thought had already peaked as of the end of 2017. So far, you've been right. I guess the question now is, does anything change your view? I know you've been following Josh Steiner's work. We've got Josh coming to Macro Voices live in August in Toronto, so I'm sure you guys will be putting your heads together there. But has anything changed in your outlook, and would anything cause you to think maybe there's another wave still before you claim victory on that one?
Well, the key thing here is that I thought that the peaks were going to come in, but for a much deeper decline in real estate, I think that you need a trigger like a rise in unemployment and a legitimate recession that forces liquidation, that can actually drive supply and create imbalance. So I think while the real estate markets have peaked, we really need to see the business cycle turn for this thing to get a little bit uglier. And so really at this stage, I sort of feel that there's no way that these real estate markets markets are going to a higher level yet. And so the top is in. That's exactly the way I forecasted it. Now we just got to see how the economy in Canada works out. What's interesting is Polos did raise interest rates in Canada just the other day. And it's interesting because the CEO of the Credit Counseling Society, Scott Hanna, basically came out and said the higher interest rates have helped cool down the country's real estate markets, helping future homeowners. I like that. Helping future homeowners because it's not helping current ones. In the end, the raising interest rates, mortgage rates, the stress testing, all of the new rules, it's really driving liquidity out of the real estate market here. And I think that there's no way it's going higher highs. I'll stand by that. I think that the peaks are in. It's just now we need a recession.
All right, number 9, U.S. dollar rallies. Well, needless to say, there's been a pretty good rally in play. Tell us what you see and what's on the horizon.
Absolutely. Well, the key thing here is that we've obviously had, especially even at the year end, we had a whole series of guests that build a pretty big picture bear scenario for the dollar. But that was an incredibly crowded trade. And I think that while the arguments for the long-term bearishness of the dollar do have merits, I think over the short to intermediate term, the liquidity was tightening, and we just were seeing a scenario where the U.S. dollar really had the potential for a big rally. It was interesting. Luke Gromen himself admitted that he tactically turned bullish on the dollar as well earlier in the year. And really at this stage, I think the U.S. dollar continues to rally throughout a good chunk of the year. It doesn't change the big picture fundamentals, but we're long the dollar here.
Number 8, China has a hard landing. Now, a lot of people have predicted big troubles for China. It hasn't really been big troubles yet.
Well, actually, this year has been certainly a lot of cracks in the armor here. Now, my argument here is that just because a lot of smart people were early to this call doesn't make them wrong. And I really think that when you look at China, you have a central planning communist government that is attempting to manipulate the business cycle. But I think a credit cycle is a credit cycle, and I don't think a government like the communist government like China will be able to control that. As far as I'm concerned, a credit contraction cycle has to happen. And so far, we've been right. The stock markets in China are down 25 to 30%. Both the A50 and the Shanghai are down quite large. And as well, with this trade war coming on, you're seeing even the Chinese yuan taking a substantial dive here in the last month or more. But really what's interesting is the cycle of what's driving the equity weakness in China. And that's this vicious cycle of panic selling, because there's literally a market-wide margin call. There was a great story on that on Zero Hedge, but their story is basically that there's $1 trillion of stock pledged as collateral for loans. And so when the credit conditions are tightening and these margin calls are coming in, it's going to create this heavy selling. And I remind everyone back in 2015 when the Chinese stock market wiped out 50% back then. It is a huge economy, but it still has cycles, and I felt that China was in a position to have a hard landing, and so far it's working out.
Number 7, economic recession starts without a yield curve inversion. Now, this one's a little harder because we don't have a recession, and we're awfully close to a yield curve inversion. Has your view changed here?
A little bit. Well, I looked at this as sort of outside the box thinking, because it really was consensus amongst almost all macro people that because the yield curve inversion has been an incredibly good predictor of recessions in the past, that this time it's going to work out exactly the same. And this forecast was really just this idea that doesn't have to happen that way. What is interesting is that about 5 months after I said this, Variant Perception, just about a month ago, came out with a great piece where they talked about the idea of whether we are going to get an inversion before the next recession. And I thought it was an interesting piece. For instance, one of the things that they pointed out was the fact that Japan has now had 6 economic recessions without a yield curve inversion. And really, I just kind of thought it was an interesting idea that, everyone's so focused on this yield curve inversion, but what if the fact that the interest rates were suppressed for so long that we don't actually get the inversion before the recession? Some argue that we're only one rate hike away from an inversion, so maybe we will have an inversion and then this forecast won't play out that way, but it was just a neat idea.
Number 6, Treasury bonds remain a safe haven as credit spread on junk blows out. Now, I've been short junk, and on one hand, you can make the argument you're kind of making a profit on the trade, but frankly, at least in my experience, by the time you cover the carry cost of paying the interest on that short position, you're really kind of treading water here. Are you doing better than I am?
The trade is pretty flat at this moment. Jeffrey Sherman basically nailed it when we had him on the show when he was talking about being short junk. It's got such a huge carry that you have to be pretty bang on the timing of a move. Otherwise, it's such a huge cost to staying short. And we use a lot of options to do this, but we're still burning time premium in staying short. So the fact that junk has been selling has made us pretty flat on this. But to me, this is a story of the fact that I think that the U.S. government is not going to have a problem financing all of its debt. The problem, though, is running massive deficits the way it is and interest rates rising this way. What they're doing is soaking up almost all the liquidity and capital within the markets and tightening the credit markets altogether. And when you tighten credit markets, in my mind, it's the lowest grade companies that are going to have the hardest time to get access to it, and will have to start paying larger and larger risk premiums in order to get access to it. And so, to me, I don't think the risk is in the Treasury bonds the way a lot of people have been talking. I think it starts with the junk bonds, and and there are, I guess, a lot of people that share that view, but that was certainly my view at the start of the year.
Well, it's my view. It was my view at the start of the year, and it still is, and it probably won't change. It's just a question of waiting for that trade to start to pay off. Next, number 5. Japanese yen trends lower. Nikkei remains one of the more resilient markets.
Well, this one is sort of a duplicate of the dollar trade, because obviously if the U.S. dollar is going to be rallying, one of the major dollar index inputs is the Japanese yen. And so there's a bit of duplication in there. But this is where we actually implemented a lot of our trades at Big Picture Trading. We're along the dollar against the yen, and we were calling the turn point back in March and April, and are currently positioned in this and are actually doing well on this trade. And one of the things I'm thinking, of course, is that when you have a general weak currency, it tends to be a tailwind for your stock markets. And so the way I look at it is if the U.S. dollar is going to be strong and the Japanese yen is going to be weak, the Nikkei has plenty of room to be resilient throughout this period. I thought we'd be a little bit stronger than we are, but overall, I think that this is working out.
Number 4. Oil peaks below $70, missed that one at least by a few dollars, and then deeply retraces the 2017 rise. Now, I'm very curious how you see this, because obviously we've gone a little bit over $70 in WTI, up as high as 75, and even higher on Brent. But my question really is, do you still see this big retrace of the 2017 rise still in the making?
Well, first off, I have to say, by no means am I an oil expert such as yourself, so I have to make this oil forecast with some humility. And I think that generally the price level I chose clearly is, in hindsight, wrong. $70 was decisively beaten here. But I think in principle, I still will stand by the forecast beyond the price level. I generally feel that at this stage, oil is going to start getting heavy here. I mean, there might be a few more thrusts on the upside, but it probably will start meeting substantial overhead resistance there. And I still believe we're going to have a good throwback later this year. Maybe it's not going to be as ugly as past oil sell-offs, but I think that staying super bullish oil is not going to play out the way a lot of people expect.
Number 3, gold starts a new bull market, and gold miners become the best performing sector.
Now, I did preface this with a tactical timing element, because obviously in one part here I'm predicting a big U.S. dollar rally. And as we've talked about numerous times on the show, a strong U.S. dollar is a massive headwind for gold. Really what I just saw was such a beaten down sector that was completely unloved. And I just felt that at some point this year there's room for the gold and gold miners to put in some key bottoms where we could see a good turn point in here, and they do very well. But clearly, right now, the U.S. dollar narrative that we predicted earlier is working out very well, and that's actually acting like a serious headwind dragging this. Maybe later in the year, there might be an opportunity, but as of this moment, this is obviously a drag.
Number 2, stock market has a liquidity event. Well, okay, I think we got to score that one as a good call, Patrick.
Absolutely. So back then, I made a call that we were anticipating there to be a market drop of at least 10 to 20% magnitude in a very short window that will end the low volatility regime, but it will not be the start of a new bear market. Now, I do want to say that we did have a lot of guests on Macro Voices that inspired me to have more confidence in making this call. It goes back to in November of 2017 when we had Francesco Fiala, we had Kevin Muir come on the show talking short vol, and then we followed that up with having Devin Anderson on there talking about the structure of the short vol and what would have to happen for us to have one of these liquidity events. Nonetheless, I did anticipate it happening. I didn't think it was going to be the start of a bear market. It's just, it was such an imbalance that when it ultimately broke, there was going to be some sort of a market event. And we were right. And more importantly, it was one of the big winners so far this year for our big picture trading members, as I've shared in the past before. So back in January, we were rolling these calendared straddles with very low volatile conditions up into the January highs, and we caught that market drop perfectly. It was a great win for us.
Number one, Bitcoin loses 90% of its value by the end of 2018. And of course, we were coming off some really high numbers toward the end of 2017.
Absolutely. And I have to commend you for this as well, because it was really our conversations throughout November and December, particularly on the air, that really inspired this. Ultimately, if you go back to when we had Marin Katusa on the show back in December 2017, in the post-game, we had some pretty good conversation about Bitcoin because it was in the parabolic phase of its rise. And obviously, you were also very bearish Bitcoin at the time. But to me, the big thing was that the parabolic rise that was occurring, we, at least from my study of bubbles technically in the past, is that while we may not be exactly able to pin down the price level where it will peak, what I was very confident in was the fact that we were, from a time frame perspective, very close to the peak. And in that episode, we were saying that I felt that there was going to be the high of Bitcoin occur in the 2017 calendar year, in the final month there. And I was right. And so were you, by the way. And the bottom line, though, is that whenever a bubble bursts, no different than the 2000 NASDAQ bubble or real estate bubble in 2000 or the silver bubble in 2011, each one of them has massive retracement. This is nothing to pick on cryptocurrencies or anything like that. Bubbles behave the same way no matter what market they're in. Now, maybe 90%, will it end up dropping 90%? Bubbles like silver only ended up dropping like $70 over 4 years. They dropped from $50 down to like $15. So it's not exactly a 90% wipeout. But maybe it won't go all the way down. But I think going from the 20,000 level down to 6,000, we can chalk this one as a one that I nailed with you. And we'll certainly see how this continues to play out. Maybe it still loses more. I don't know. What's your thinking?
Well, it's interesting how we each see it a little bit differently. You're saying here your prediction was loses 90% of its value by year-end 2018. Now, I could be persuaded to go as far as 95%, but I would not say by year-end 2018. I don't know. For all I know, we could be seeing a bottom and it moves even to higher highs here. I think that right now we are in this cryptocurrency complacency bubble where a lot of people just don't understand that the blockchain distributed ledger technology is a good first try. I likened this to the Wright Flyer, one of the most important technological inventions of all time. That's why it's hanging in the Smithsonian Museum right now, for the huge contribution that it made to history of technology. Super important, as is Bitcoin. But you know what? You don't see a lot of Wright Flyers parked on the ramp when you go to the airport. We've got Airbuses and Boeings and so forth. And I don't think the crypto community understands that proof of work based blockchain is not the right solution in the end. There's going to be a better technology. There's something else is going to replace Bitcoin before this digital currency, revolution that we're seeing is over. And I'm a huge, huge believer in the future of digital currency. I just don't think that the first generation cryptocurrencies really have any place to go. And you've got to realize Bitcoin, it has market share. It's kind of perceived as being first, although it wasn't really first. It's got a lot going for it, and I think it could continue for a while. At some point, somebody's going to break through this proof of work barrier and come up with a better way to do a fully decentralized distributed ledger that doesn't need proof of work. And if that's another coin, then all of a sudden I think Bitcoin is going to collapse completely. But we'll see. And incidentally, I just realized, Patrick, as we're talking here, we haven't ever announced on the air, but my talk at Macro Voices Live in August is entirely about the future of digital currency, not cryptocurrency. That's a flash in the pan as far as I'm concerned. I don't want to talk about the Wright Flyer. I want to talk about the Airbus A380 and what it looks like and what the future digital currency that's integrated with a digital sovereign bond market and the rest of it will look like. So we'll get that for our audience that's coming to Macro Voices Live. In the meantime, I think that you basically have the right idea here. I just don't think that the Bitcoin end game is necessarily this year. I think it could have a couple more years left in it because what hasn't happened yet is nobody has found a way to do a completely decentralized distributed ledger which does not rely on a proof of work algorithm. And I think that's the technology breakthrough that's needed to put the final nail in the Bitcoin coffin. And I think it might be a couple years out still. In any case, Patrick, we need to move along here, and if there's anything I've learned from you, Patrick, as the producer of Macro Voices, it is to negotiate with the guests we bring on the show and make sure we get a sweet deal for our Macro Voices listeners. So this presentation ended on slide 4 here when I talked to you earlier this afternoon. I pressured you a little bit to add slide 5 to give Macro Voices listeners who might be interested in this. Of course, your big picture trading clients got all these predictions way back in December of last year, and they've also been getting webinars with you 4 days a week in terms of trading recommendations and advice in order to play these markets. For our Macro Voices listeners who are not yet big picture trading clients and might be interested in doing so, how about some kind of freebie? What do you got for us on slide 5?
So, Eric, what we're going to do is we're going to offer Macro Voice listeners a complimentary 7-day members pass for anyone that wants to have a look behind the curtain at what we do at Big Picture Trading. In order to get that access, you can either visit bigpicturetrading.com and register on the website or email us at info@bigpicturetrading.com.
Now, I got to ask, Patrick, is this one of those things where I got to give you a credit card and take an authorization before I get signed up and, I only get my money back if I ask for a refund, or is this truly no strings attached?
It is a no credit card required, no strings attached offer. It's just an opportunity for our Macro Voice listeners to see what I do at Big Picture Trading.
Fantastic. Well, I strongly encourage everybody to take advantage of that. It's free, it's good stuff, and you get a chance to see what Patrick does every single day. Meanwhile, we need your help to promote Macro Voices because the more registered users we have at macrovoices.com, the more able Patrick is to negotiate to get the very best feature interview guests on the program, like Dr. Pippa Malmgren today. So, if you haven't yet, go to macrovoices.com, register your free account. It only takes a few minutes, doesn't cost anything. We won't spam you. We won't try to sell you anything. The benefit to you is you'll get our free Research Roundup email, which never contains any advertising or marketing. It's just a compendium of links to all of the coolest content that we could find on the internet, including supporting documentation that goes with our feature interviews. Patrick, tell them what's in this week's Research Roundup.
So, Eric, this week you're going to find the transcript for today's interview with Pippa. You'll also find the link to the chart book that both of us discussed throughout the postgame. There's also an article from Harley Bassman that called Catch a Wave. There's also an interesting article that, according to Morgan Stanley, the Fed will be forced to halt quantitative tightening early and expand its balance sheet by 2020. Also, you're going to find a link to an IIF report issuing a warning as global debt hits a record $247 trillion. So you'll find this and so much more in this week's Research Roundup. So that does it for this week's episode. We appreciate all the feedback and support we get from our listeners, and we're always looking for suggestions on how we can make the program even better. Now, for those of our listeners that write or blog about the markets and would like to share that content with our listeners, send us an email at researchroundup@macrovoices.com or tag it with the MVRR hashtag on Twitter, and we'll include it in our weekly distributions. If you have not already, follow our main Twitter account at Macro Voices for all the most recent updates and releases. You can also follow Eric on Twitter at Eric S. Townsend and myself at Patrick Ceresna. On behalf of Eric Townsend and myself, thank you for listening, and we'll see you all next week.
That concludes this edition of Macro Voices. Be sure to tune in each week to hear feature interviews with the brightest minds in finance and macroeconomics. Macro Voices is made possible by sponsorship from BigPictureTrading.com, the Internet's premier source of online education for traders. Please visit BigPictureTrading.com for more information. Please register your free account at MacroVoices.com. Once registered, you'll receive our free weekly Research Roundup email containing links to supporting documents from our featured guests and the very best free financial content our volunteer research team could find on the Internet each week. You'll also gain access to our free listener discussion forums and research library. And the more registered users we have, the more we'll be able to recruit high-profile feature interview guests for future programs. So please register your free account today at macrovoices.com if you haven't already. You can subscribe to Macro Voices on iTunes to have Macro Voices automatically delivered to your mobile device each week free of charge. You can email questions for the program to mailbag@macrovoices.com, and we'll answer your questions on the air from time to time in our mailbag segment. Macro Voices is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Macro Voices should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Macro Voices are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or sponsors. Macro Voices, its producers, sponsors, and hosts Eric Townsend and Patrick Ceresna shall not be liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on information or viewpoints presented on Macro Voices. Macro Voices is made possible by sponsorship from BigPictureTrading.com and by funding from Fourth Turning Capital Management, LLC. For more information, visit macrovoices.com.